It was meant to be a private life's final quiet, a penthouse above a bank, thick curtains drawn against the winter sea, the hum of Monaco far below. Instead, the night ended in smoke and a door that would not open. Firefighters would later stand on the roof and look into a bathroom that had become a locked refuge. Inside, two people, one of the world's most private bankers and a devoted nurse, were found dead, overcome by smoke and the strange, almost unbearable weight of mistrust. Outside, the world buzzed with rumors. Inside, a single act had ruptured an elegant life into fragments. When the smoke cleared, there was more than grief. There were questions that clung like ash: who lit that fire, and why would anyone set ablaze in a home wired like a fortress? Why had Edmond Safra, a man who had built his life guarding secrets, refused to open the door to rescuers? And who, in the press of servants and guards, had the courage or the cunning to turn a disaster into a stage? This is the story of Edmond Safra's final night, a tale of wealth, secrecy, and a crime that would haunt Monaco for decades. Edmond J. Safra was one of the 20th century's quiet colossi of banking, a scion of a Sephardic banking family who quietly amassed an empire of private banks spanning continents. He was a man whose office portraits are austere, whose philanthropy funded synagogues and libraries, and whose discretion made him the guardian of other people's fortunes. He moved in a world where confidentiality was a currency and reputation could open doors that money could not. He was 67 when he died. In 1999, Safra had just completed one of the crowning moves of his career, the sale of major banking interests to a global institution. He divided his time between city offices and the Riviera, maintaining a penthouse in one of Monaco's most secure buildings literally above, in some ways, the bank itself. The apartment was as fortified as the man's public silence: alarms, reinforced doors, staff 24/7. Yet human frailty does not respect security systems. Among his inner circle were trusted staff, nurses who attended to Safra's advanced Parkinson's disease, house staff who maintained routines, and household aides who moved quietly in the corridors. Those closest to him described a man with contradictions, fiercely private yet open-handed with causes he cared about, intense in attention to detail yet comfortable delegating the small things of daily life. He relied, like many who age in the public eye, on a small cadre of people who were paid handsomely and expected, in return, absolute loyalty. One of those people was Theodore Ted Marr, an American nurse who had been hired to help care for Safra. Marr's resume was a patchwork of claims, military years, varied jobs, and a chapter that would complicate his life indefinitely. Another nurse in the household, Vivian Torrente, was also present on the night the tragedy began. The household, tightly staffed and accustomed to a kind of private rhythm, would find itself at the center of public scrutiny when that rhythm was broken. To the outside eye, Monaco glittered as always: palm trees strung with light, yachts at calm anchor, a principality where privilege was a way of life. That image, however, hides the way human tensions persist in gilded rooms: resentments over small things, fear of exposure, the transactional calculations that follow a large estate. This is the setting where a domestic night would become a legal saga, a secure penthouse, a small circle of caretakers, and a man whose enemies were often as invisible as his bank accounts. It started in the small hours, a whisper of alarm at first, a report of something amiss, then a blast of smoke that spread like a bad secret. At roughly 5 a.m, a fire took hold in the two-story penthouse. By the time emergency calls were made and crews arrived, the building's roof and the apartment's facade bore blackened scars. Neighbors watched in stunned silence as sirens punctured the Riviera dawn. Inside the penthouse, Safra and one of his nurses had retreated to a bathroom that was, in effect, a secure refuge, a thick door that could be locked from the inside, a place where one could feel protected against intruders in a world where confrontation was not to be trusted. According to later reports, they had closed themselves in, perhaps believing the danger was outside. The door would not be opened for them. They died of smoke inhalation. The scene was, from the start, confusing. Early accounts described intruders, reports of a struggle circulated, a male nurse recovered with minor knife wounds, stories of shadows flitting through corridors. The press seized on the drama: wealthy banker trapped, intruders in a supposedly impregnable apartment, a violent mystery over a man many believed no one would want to kill. But the facts that investigators would assemble in the months to come began to point in a different direction. Fire investigators traced the blaze to a wastebasket in the master bedroom area, an odd place for a fire to begin if two masked intruders had been the cause. Further, forensic traces would reveal a deliberate ignition, accelerant residues and patterns consistent with someone intending the fire to spread. The hypothesis that this was a burglary gone wrong began to lose plausibility in the face of evidence that suggested human intent. In the aftermath, an extraordinary claim surfaced: a man who had been hailed as a hero, the nurse who had called for help, later admitted to having started the blaze himself. That admission upended simple narratives and forced investigators and the public to ask how and why someone would create a peril and then position themselves as its rescuer. Who died that night? Edmond Safra, the man at the heart of a global banking circle, and Vivian Torrente, a nurse who had worked in his household. Their deaths were more than the end of lives, they became the hinge on which questions of motive, betrayal, and self-invention would turn. The tragedy was not only about smoke and flame, it was about a plan that would be told again and again, each retelling exposing new cracks. The investigation began at a site of both physical and psychological complexity, a penthouse whose very design mirrored its owner's preference for secrecy. Monaco's judicial police, experienced in dealing with wealthy defendants and the quirks of high-profile crime, moved with procedural care. They photographed, swabbed, and recorded, and then they listened to neighbors, to staff, to anyone who might have seen or heard the night's arc fire. Investigators examined the origin point. The wastebasket's burn pattern, the presence of accelerant, and the way the flames fed on particular materials suggested arson. Chemical tests revealed compounds that regular accidental fires do not typically produce. Forensics found that the bathroom, the sealed sanctuary, had filled with smoke in a way that would have made escape difficult once the door was closed. The question moved quickly: was this a staged intrusion, or an act that began among the household itself? Interviews with staff revealed conflicting stories about that early morning. One nurse, Mar, had called emergency services, another male caregiver suffered knife wounds. Mar's call saved the day, or so it seemed at first, because it brought help quickly. But detectives were trained to watch the details that strangers missed: tones, inconsistencies, the small acts of omission that reveal a scripted drama. Mar initially described intruders. He told authorities that he struggled, that someone had stabbed the male nurse, and that he raced to summon help. The narrative fit the drama of a rescue. But the physical evidence and later testimony began to push against that script. Investigators found traces of accelerant and a pattern of ignition inconsistent with a spontaneous conflagration. The question of intent resurfaced over and over. Chemical analyses of debris from the wastebasket showed residues that pointed to a deliberate ignition. Laboratory work, cross-checked with fire dynamics, suggested someone had used an accelerant to ensure the fire would spread rapidly. The burn patterns did not align with an accidental smoldering. This technical detail matters because it moves the investigation from a tragic accident to a criminal act: intentional ignition, not a freak fault in wiring. No investigator can ignore motive. Why would someone want Edmond Safra dead? He was a man who had made enemies by exposing wrongdoings among clients and associates. He had enemies across continents. Speculation ranged from revenge by a business rival to something more intimate, a domestic betrayal. But motive in this case had two faces: the motive for causing harm and the motive for creating a spectacle of rescue. That subtlety became essential. As detectives dug into household dynamics, they found a web of contradictions: loyalty pressed against ambition, service folded into dependency, and staff who enjoyed not only generous pay but proximity to power. Mar's background mattered: his past stories of military time, his time in various roles, and his position as a gatekeeper in Safra's private life gave him both access and presence at critical moments. Investigators probed previous conversations, small financial transfers, and interpersonal conflicts for clues. Perhaps the most dramatic turn came when Mar, after intensive questioning, admitted to having started the fire. His explanation framed the act as a foolish attempt to create a scenario where he might emerge as a savior. According to Marr's confession, he had set a small blaze in the hope that the alarm would allow him to rescue Safra and be seen as the heroic figure, a narrative that he hoped would shore up his place in the household and perhaps secure a continued role. In court, Marr would say at times that the deaths were unintended, that he had never meant for anyone to die, and that the plan had been to create only a limited reaction. The prosecution would, however, interpret the actions as criminally reckless, and possibly more malicious. Investigators studied injuries. The male nurse with knife wounds had an account to tell, a moment of chaos between alleged intruders and the staff. There were scraps of cloth, small traces of material that suggested movement or struggle, and fingerprints that were matched and rematched. Every trace entered into a timeline. Experts reconstructed the minutes, the ignition, the alarm, the retreat to the bathroom, and then the growth of smoke that made the door a trap rather than a refuge. As the evidence accumulated, Monaco's prosecutors built a case focusing on Marr's act of setting the fire and the foreseeability of the deaths that followed. The defense argued different points, that any confession had been coerced or that an attempted rescue could not be equated with intent to kill. They emphasized the improbability that a trusted attendant would want to harm his employer. They painted a portrait of a man who loved his job, who called for help in good faith, and who could not have imagined the horror that would unfold. But investigators relied on the science, accelerant residues, burn patterns, testimonies that did not cohere with a surprise burglary, and Marr's own statements about the ignition. When evidence of deliberate ignition is combined with subsequent death, the legal charge moves from manslaughter by neglect toward arson leading to death. The trial was a spectacle of a different kind, not the private elegance of a Monaco penthouse but the sterner theater of the courtroom. For journalists and the public, it provided a way to assemble a narrative of motive and action from the fragments the investigators had collected. For the victim's family, it was a stage upon which grief, anger, and the desire for answers played out. Prosecutors framed their argument plainly: an employee had intentionally lit a fire, and that action foreseeably led to the deaths of Edmond Safra and Vivian Torrente. They argued that Marr's behavior before and after the ignition, the choice of location for the blaze, the timing, and the subsequent actions could not be read as an innocent prank gone wrong. Expert witnesses, including fire scientists and pathologists, laid out how quickly smoke would have filled the bathroom and why the two victims could not have been safely rescued once they hardened themselves behind the door. The defense offered a different reading. They conceded that Marr started the fire, but argued that his intention had been a misbegotten stunt to set off an alarm, to seem brave, perhaps to cement his place in the household. They maintained there was no proof of intent to kill. They also attacked the credibility of some witnesses, suggesting motives for lying, and they highlighted procedural questions about how evidence had been gathered. In November 2002, the court rendered its verdict: Marr was found guilty of arson leading to death. He was given a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime. The conviction did not close the book on debate, it simply placed the judicial stamp on one interpretation of a messy, tragic sequence. The judge found that the act of starting the fire had been criminal and that the deaths were the direct result of a reckless act. The legal verdict, a conviction for arson causing death, gave some measure of public closure, but it did not erase the unsettling details that lingered. Marr was sentenced to prison. In time he would serve years behind bars. He was, according to subsequent reporting, released after serving 8 years of a 10-year sentence, an outcome that spurred debate in both the legal and public spheres about the adequacy of punishment and the nature of confession-driven cases. Beyond the individual sentence, the case rippled outward. Edmond Safra's name, once synonymous with utmost discretion, became bound to headlines and speculation. His foundations and philanthropy, while enduring in many ways, had to negotiate the glare of publicity that never sat easily with private giving. His estate and family faced a complicated calculus: grief, legal action, and the management of worldwide holdings. For Monaco, a state that thrives on an image of impeccable order and discretion, the scandal touched a nerve. The tragedy prompted different actors, from household managers to insurers and emergency services, to re-examine protocols. How should domestic staff be vetted? What obligations do private hosts have for guest and staff safety? What emergency training should caretakers receive? The specifics changed in different places, but the broader effect was a new focus on risk management in private estates. No high-profile crime involving wealth and secrecy avoids alternate narratives. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some pointed to enemies Safra might have made in the banking world, some asked, near hysterically, whether more powerful forces had a hand in his death. Documentaries and books would later probe these angles, appealing and repellent as any, because ambiguity invites storytelling and the mind prefers patterns, even invented ones, to the blank ache of uncertainty. The household staff who witnessed the night's events were irrevocably changed. Careers ended, friendships collapsed under the pressure of court cases and public scorn. Those who had been present would vie, in different accounts, to be heard as victims, bystanders, or heroes. The dead, Safra and Torrente, were mourned privately by those who loved them and reconstructed publicly by those who sought meaning in headlines. Beyond verdicts and headlines, the story's core remains the human cost. A man who had spent a life building private institutions died trapped by smoke and, most painfully, by fear, the fear that pushed him to remain behind a locked door rather than open it to potential rescuers. 2 families mourned. Staff who had been paid to comfort, to be guardians of health and dignity, suddenly found themselves in the crucible of public suspicion. Grief took shape quietly, in letters released by family members, in small memorials rather than public monuments. Friends described Edmond as exacting but generous, someone who loved literature and scholarship and who gave to synagogues and charities with a generosity that could be surprising in its scale. Vivian Torrente's family remembered her as someone who showed devotion in small gestures, steady presence at the bedside, the patient touch of care workers who become more than employees to those they help. And for Theodore Marr, the cost was equally profound. Whatever his motives and the law established his criminal culpability, he left the trial with a prison sentence and, for many, the mark of an act that could not be undone. He walked into a life on the other side of bars with a name forever tied to a blaze that took 2 lives. Later reporting would follow his life beyond Monaco's walls: escapes, releases, and further brushes with the law, a reminder that criminal acts reverberate far beyond the initial moment of misjudgment. The tragedy of Edmond Safra's death does not sit comfortably inside tidy boxes. It resists easy moralizing. On the one hand, there is a legal and moral clarity: someone lit a fire and people died. The law found an answer and assigned responsibility. On the other hand, the story raises quieter, more unsettling questions about the life of privilege and the fragility hidden beneath it. We like to tell ourselves that wealth secures safety, gated entrances, private staff, and teams of advisors all promise control. But human relationships, the ones at the heart of caregiving, of trust, of daily intimacy, can carry their own risks. Caretakers can become overseers, dependency can curdle into resentment, and over-reliance on appearances can lead to blunted vigilance. The bathroom behind a locked door becomes an image of how protection can become imprisonment. There is also a reminder here about the stories we accept. The lure of being a rescuer, the temptation to stage a narrative where one emerges as hero, speaks to something more fragile: identity constructed through dramatic acts, a yearning to be indispensable. That yearning, when acted upon in reckless ways, can create devastation. Finally, the case invites us to consider institutional responsibility. Wealth and discretion should not be buffers that allow corners of life to go unregulated. The safety of vulnerable people, whether the elderly, those with illness, or those dependent on caregivers, matters. Houses of privilege carry obligations not only to comfort but to the hard, exacting work of keeping people truly safe. When a man who had made a life out of protecting other people's wealth died swallowed by smoke in his own fortress, the moral is not simple. It is not a single villain or a single cure. It is a messy ledger of choices, small and large, that we, collectively, must account for. The yacht of lies becomes the penthouse of a man who trusted the wrong thing at the wrong time, the illusion that security is the same as safety, and that image can substitute for responsibility. If there is a last, human image to carry from this story, it is this: a late winter morning, a door kept closed, a man and a nurse in a sealed room, and the lingering question of what it would take for someone to choose to open that door when the smoke enters. The answer arrives too late for those who died, but not too late for the changes, however small, the case forced into the world. In the end, the tragedy asks of us only one small thing: to consider how we care for one another when the night grows long and the alarms begin to sound.